What I want to talk about tonight is a little bit of an update on Washington, because there is a lot going on right now in the nation's capital. But to speak for a few minutes about what I find deeply troubling in American politics right now, and that is the growing gap between the two political parties, and the fact that Republicans and Democrats don't work with one another, they barely talk with one another, and it has gotten so bad that the nation's business, the biggest problems facing this country, many of them are not going to be solved until we find a way around this. And I think it's something that we ought to be talking about as a people. It shouldn't just be a conversation we're having in Washington. So I think it's important to talk about it in places like Columbia.
How do you do that? How do you take the discussion out, down to the grassroots?
By having a conversation, by talking about it, which is what I'm going to do tonight. It's already a conversation you're having here in South Carolina. It's the reason for this, a large part of the reason for this award, to highlight efforts that are made by public servants who don't just assume the other party is the enemy, not just the adversary, but the enemy. But I think, all of us in this country ought to be talking about it. It's not something that it takes a journalist to talk about. I mean, ordinary Americans who care about what's happening in this country ought to be having these conversations too.
Agreed. What are some of you've taught a few courses on a few of the challenges that your industry faces, journalism. What are some of the challenges, and where do you see this industry over the next 10 years?
Well, journalism is at a crossroads right now. We are going through a period of transition, the likes of which I've never seen, and I don't think has occurred since the beginning of television news or broadcast news, which is what I work in. Newspapers are closing down all over the country. Journalists, reporters are being laid off by the hundreds and even by the thousands. Because everybody's now getting their news, almost everybody, online, and they're getting it for free. And so there's no money to pay journalists to do what they do, which is report. And we haven't figured out a way to fix that. And until we do, we are going to keep bleeding reporters. Our journalism is going to be weakened in this country. Now, I applaud the internet. I think it's terrific. I think all kind of good things come out of blogs and the rest of it. But at the same time, we need to have what I call solid core reporting going on, and that's what we have less of right now.
Yeah. What are a few of your favorite memories and fondest memories looking back on how many years in journalism and broadcasting?
30 years in Washington plus a few, and 40 years almost altogether as a reporter. There's so many. I don't even know where to begin. I started out as a local reporter in Atlanta covering the city council and covering stories on blockbusting and real estate, racial discrimination. Probably the most exciting stories were covering the White House, the Camp David Accords under President Carter. In a more negative way, I was at the White House covering President Reagan when he was shot by John Hinckley, and of course was at CNN when 9/11 happened. So the things that stand out the most in your mind are often the worst things. But the truth is that some of the most meaningful things I've done in my career have been just talking to ordinary Americans about what matters to them, why they vote or don't vote, what they think about our political system, and why they think this is a great country. That, to me, has had the most resonance.
And definition of leadership. Maybe the celebration tonight is centered around leadership, maybe legislative leadership, but do you kind of have a personal definition of leadership or leaders you admire?
I would say, as a journalist and somebody who's watched political leadership in this country for a long time, that it's probably not a definition that people aren't familiar with. It's people who have the courage of their convictions, who are willing to get ahead of the crowd, who aren't going to be waiting to find out what the polls show before they decide what they're going to do or what they believe. It's people who are prepared to say something that may not be the most popular thing in the room or in the country, and people who have integrity. We've been let down by a number of our public servants over time. It's human nature. We're all human. We all make mistakes. So we don't expect perfection, but it would be terrific if we had more people, I think, who were prepared stand on principle and not worry about the consequences.